Picture this. You're walking through the grand halls of Versailles. Golden ceilings, sparkling chandeliers, velvet curtains, and the most lavish decorations money can buy. The air is thick with the scent of roses and the finest perfumes. Everything looks flawless, right? But hold on, there's a dirty little secret behind all this grandeur. The royals of Versailles, the very picture of elegance, lived in squalor that would make your skin crawl. Yes, those beautiful gowns and perfectly powdered wigs, not so glamorous up close. While the outside world marveled at their beauty, the truth was far messier and shockingly unsanitary. Want to know the shocking hygiene habits the royal women of Versailles had to endure? Trust me, you won't believe the truth behind their polished exteriors. Get ready for a story of filth, neglect, and royal deception you'll never forget. Imagine this: the royals of Versailles, surrounded by the finest luxuries, never bathed. That's right, no refreshing baths, no soaps, no modern hygiene practices. Why, they believed that warm water opened the pores and invited illness, so they avoided it at all costs. Instead, they used cloths soaked in vinegar, alcohol, or unbelievably spit to clean themselves. When they did bathe, which was rare, the whole royal family shared the same bath water. The men went first, and by the time the women had their turn, the water was filthy. No privacy, no cleanliness, just discomfort. Imagine enduring that, while still expected to look poised and graceful. The royal family wasn't just ignoring hygiene, they were actively creating an environment for disease to thrive. The long-term consequences of these practices were severe. Their skin became prone to infections, rashes, and chronic irritation. The lack of proper care caused health problems that lasted throughout their lives, weakening their bodies and leaving them vulnerable to diseases. And this wasn't just about appearance. Their neglect led to persistent health issues that chronicled their suffering behind closed doors. What's even more shocking is that despite all the power and wealth, they couldn't manage something as basic as hygiene. The royals of Versailles may have been the picture of beauty and grace on the outside, but their bodies were rotting under the surface. Their obsession with appearance over actual health turned their palace into a breeding ground for illness and discomfort. Their self-inflicted suffering didn't just stop with dirty skin. The royals suffered from chronic fatigue infections and frequent illnesses problems that could have been prevented with the simplest act of bathing. But instead of focusing on health, they sacrificed it for vanity. So while the palace gleamed with luxury behind it, lay a silent epidemic of hygiene neglect that slowly ate away at their well-being. They may have looked perfect, but the long-term cost of their choices was brutal. What should have been a place of health and wellness became a breeding ground for disease. If you thought things couldn't get worse, here's the next shocker: the royals had no toilets. Despite living in one of the grandest palaces in Europe, the royal family used chamber pots, which were simply bowls for relieving themselves. And the worst part? The contents were tossed out of the window directly into the streets of Versailles. It wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a daily practice. The royal family, along with their court, openly discarded waste without a second thought, creating a constant health hazard. This wasn't just a minor issue, it had long-term consequences. The lack of proper sanitation contributed to the spread of disease throughout the palace. With waste constantly spilling into the streets, the air was tainted, and the royal court became vulnerable to outbreaks of sickness. What should have been a symbol of health and prosperity was instead a breeding ground for illness. But it wasn't just the lack of privacy that made this so shocking. The palace's plumbing system was outdated, with waste often backing up into the kitchens where food was prepared. Imagine eating a meal in a palace where raw sewage might be backing up in the same rooms. The royals, completely detached from reality, were exposed to these risks daily. The emotional cost of this neglect was severe. While the royal court maintained its image of perfection behind closed doors, the royals were living in squalor. Foreign visitors were horrified, and many left Versailles in disgust, unable to believe that the most powerful family in Europe had no regard for hygiene. The long-term effects were clear: chronic illnesses, foodborne diseases, and a royal family exposed to risks that should have been unimaginable. At Versailles, they lived in luxury on the surface but ignored basic needs. Their obsession with appearances came at the cost of their health, and the consequences were felt long after the palace doors closed. The royals' refusal to address these basic issues shows how, despite their wealth and power, they were just as vulnerable to disease as anyone else. The very grandeur they worked so hard to create was tainted by neglect. The royal obsession with perfection extended to every aspect of their appearance, but nothing was more shocking than their lice-infested hair. The towering hairstyles worn by the women at Versailles, which were symbols of beauty and power, were actually a perfect breeding ground for lice. These extravagant hairdos were built with padding horsehair and layers of animal fat pomades, creating the ideal environment for lice to thrive. While these towering hairstyles were the height of fashion, they were also a nightmare for hygiene. The royals lived with these infestations because there was no real way to properly clean or manage their hair. The combination of sweat grease and layers of styling made their hair a breeding ground for lice. Instead of regular washing or treatment, the royals would use lice claws, silver combs designed to scratch their heads and alleviate the constant itching. This was their way of dealing with the discomfort, but it did nothing to address the root of the problem. The long-term consequences were far from glamorous. Constant itching rashes and infections were common due to the lice. The royals lived in constant discomfort, their efforts to look graceful overshadowed by the underlying reality of their unsanitary grooming habits. The need to maintain their perfect image kept them trapped in a cycle of neglecting their health for the sake of appearances. Their beauty and elegance were built on a foundation of unsanitary practices, and the long-term effects were physically painful. Their obsession with outward perfection came at a cost. The royal family may have looked pristine on the outside, but the reality of their hair and grooming habits was uncomfortable, unhygienic, and often caused chronic issues. Their refusal to address these problems led to long-term health consequences that could have been easily avoided. It's a stark reminder that no matter how beautiful someone looks on the outside, neglecting basic hygiene leads to inevitable discomfort and illness. In a palace where everything was designed for perfection, the royals were forced to live with constant irritation and physical distress because they chose to maintain an image of flawless beauty rather than deal with the reality of their infested and unhealthy hair. Their luxurious appearances hid a world of suffering and discomfort, proving that the pursuit of perfection often comes with hidden and painful consequences. At Versailles, the royal feasts were the height of luxury. Sumptuous meals of roasted meats, delicate pastries, and exotic fruits. But behind the grandeur of these banquets lay a terrifying truth. The food was often unsafe to eat. Despite their wealth, the royals were exposed to bacteria, parasites, and contamination in nearly every meal. The royal kitchens lacked proper refrigeration and sanitation, meaning food was often spoiled or improperly stored. Meat and vegetables were sometimes kept for days rotting in the hot, humid kitchen environment. With no proper waste disposal, raw sewage from the palace would often back up into the kitchens, contaminating the very food meant to nourish the royals. Even King Louis XIV wasn't immune to the consequences. He famously passed a 6-inch tapeworm after eating undercooked meat. The royals were regularly exposed to foodborne diseases from stomach issues to more serious infections. Their feasts meant to symbolize wealth and power were actually health hazards in disguise. The long-term effects of these dangerous eating habits were significant. The royals suffered from chronic digestive problems and were constantly vulnerable to food-related illnesses. They had all the luxury in the world, but no idea how to ensure their health or safety when it came to food. Despite the risk, the royals continued to indulge in these dangerous banquets, ignoring the potential for illness. The long-term consequences of their neglect, chronic health problems, weakened immune systems, and a lifestyle built on excess and neglect. What was meant to be a symbol of luxury was in reality a gamble with their health, and they paid the price. The royals may have dined in style, but their failure to prioritize food safety led to a hidden epidemic of illness that they couldn't escape. The palaces were opulent, but the kitchens were a ticking time bomb. Childbirth at Versailles wasn't the private, intimate experience we imagine today. It was a public spectacle. The royal family's need to prove the legitimacy of their heirs meant that childbirth was not only an intensely painful and private moment, but also a performance for the entire court. The birth of a royal heir had to be witnessed by doctors, courtiers, and sometimes even strangers, to ensure no doubts about the child's legitimacy. For the mother, this meant enduring the excruciating pain of childbirth, while maintaining a sense of grace and composure in front of a crowd. There was no privacy, no compassion, just the relentless pressure to appear perfect. The royals saw this as a necessary procedure to secure the bloodline, but the physical and emotional toll on the women was enormous. The long-term consequences were deeply damaging. The intense pain and lack of privacy led to emotional scars and psychological trauma, as these women were forced to sacrifice their well-being for the throne. After enduring a public, painful ordeal, the royal women were expected to return to their duties almost immediately. There was no time to recover. They had to attend social functions, make public appearances, and perform their royal roles, all while their bodies were still recovering from the trauma of childbirth. Physically, the long-term effects of this constant exposure and forced recovery were devastating. Many of the royal women faced chronic health issues from the neglect of their post-birth care, leading to weakened bodies and a lifetime of discomfort. The royal family may have portrayed a picture-perfect image, but behind closed doors, the women of Versailles were living with the long-lasting damage caused by these public, grueling childbirths. This brutal practice of exposing childbirth to the public left an enduring mark on the women who endured it. It wasn't just about securing heirs. It was about preserving the royal image at the expense of the women's physical and mental health. What should have been a private moment of life became a royal ordeal, and the consequences of this neglect and pressure lasted far beyond the birth itself. While the royals of Versailles meticulously crafted their image of elegance and perfection, foreign visitors were often horrified by the reality they encountered behind the palace's walls. Guests arriving at Versailles, expecting to witness grandeur, were instead met with unsanitary conditions that were impossible to ignore. The palace, despite its wealth and beauty, was filled with the stench of human waste and a shocking disregard for basic hygiene. One of the most disturbing revelations was the lack of proper sanitation. The royal family, despite their immense power and resources, used chamber pots throughout the palace, and the contents were simply tossed out of the windows onto the streets of Versailles. Imagine being a visitor stepping into a grand palace full of opulent furnishings and gold-plated details, only to be overwhelmed by the odor of waste. This wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a regular practice. The royals' disregard for cleanliness shocked visitors, especially those from countries where sanitation was taken far more seriously. But the impact went beyond just the smell. The lack of proper waste management meant that Versailles became a breeding ground for disease. With human waste regularly being thrown into the streets, there was a constant risk of contamination. Visitors to the palace, particularly diplomats and foreign dignitaries, were horrified by the disarray and lack of sanitation. Many left Versailles with a deep sense of disgust, having witnessed firsthand the gap between the royal family's luxurious image and the unhygienic reality of life at court. The long-term consequences of this neglect were evident. The royal family, for all their wealth, lived in an environment where disease was always lurking. Chronic illnesses were commonplace, fueled by the unsanitary conditions of the palace. Foreign guests could see the stark contrast between the public image of Versailles and the grim reality within. The royal court may have been built on opulence, but it was also built on a foundation of neglect, and the consequences of this would reverberate through the generations. In the end, Versailles, with all its glittering beauty, became a symbol of decay and contradiction. The royals' obsession with maintaining an outwardly flawless image ultimately blinded them to the basic essential needs of cleanliness and hygiene. Their failure to prioritize these basic principles came with long-lasting consequences, not only for the royals themselves, but for their entire court. Versailles may have been the pinnacle of luxury and grandeur, golden halls, elaborate gowns, and lavish feasts. But behind the glittering surface, the royals were living in a state of contradiction. While they dazzled the world with their beauty, grace, and wealth, their personal hygiene practices were shockingly neglectful. The royal court was obsessed with maintaining an image of flawless elegance, but this came at the expense of their well-being. They rarely bathed, instead relying on damp cloths soaked in vinegar or alcohol to clean themselves, leaving their skin vulnerable to infections and irritations. They used chamber pots which were tossed out of the windows into the streets and continued to live in environments riddled with lice. Their grand hairstyles, often towering feet above their heads, were a breeding ground for lice, yet they persisted in wearing them without proper care. The royals may have appeared pristine on the outside, but the reality was a constant state of discomfort and poor hygiene. Their kitchens, where the finest food was prepared, were also unsanitary, with food often being contaminated by spoiled ingredients, bacteria, and even waste. This left the royal court exposed to constant foodborne diseases and digestive issues. Despite all their wealth, the royal family was at high risk for health problems. Their obsession with public perfection led to their private suffering. The long-term consequences of this neglect were severe. Chronic skin infections, intestinal issues, and a weakened immune system became part of the royal lifestyle. The royals of Versailles had all the power in the world, but couldn't protect themselves from the basic health risks that come with neglecting hygiene. Their luxury became a curse, as their inability to care for themselves led to long-lasting health issues. In the end, Versailles was the ultimate example of decay disguised as grandeur. The royals spent their lives maintaining an image of beauty and power. Yet their failure to address basic hygiene left them vulnerable to disease and physical suffering. It's a stark reminder that true luxury isn't about appearances. It's about well-being and care for the body. No matter how grand your palace or how exquisite your attire, if you neglect your health, the cracks will eventually show. The royals of Versailles may have lived in unimaginable luxury, but their neglect of basic hygiene and well-being tells a different story. Behind the grandeur of the palace, the royals were exposed to disease, discomfort, and chronic health issues. They lived in an illusion of perfection, but the reality was filled with lice waste and unclean conditions that affected their health for years to come. The long-term consequences of their actions were clear: weakened immune systems, chronic infections, and a constant battle with illnesses. Despite all their wealth and power, they were vulnerable to the same health risks as anyone else. Their obsession with maintaining an outward image of perfection at all costs came at a high price, both physically and emotionally. The lessons here are stark and timeless. Perfection is an illusion, and no amount of wealth or beauty can replace the importance of health, self-care, and hygiene. The royals of Versailles may have been the picture of beauty and power, but their disregard for basic hygiene led them down a path of physical suffering and vulnerability. Their story serves as a warning that no matter how beautiful or powerful you appear on the outside, if you neglect your health, it will catch up with you. Ultimately, the royal experience at Versailles highlights the danger of vanity. The more the royals focused on their outward image, the more they neglected what truly mattered. Let their story remind us to prioritize well-being, balance, and care for our bodies, rather than chasing after an unrealistic idea of perfection. True luxury lies not in appearance, but in the health and comfort we provide for ourselves.